In the winter of 1878, a substitute teacher in Cedar Creek, Indiana, made a discovery that would haunt the Methodist community for generations. 50 children had vanished over 2 years from the town's most beloved Sunday school program. Children whose names appeared in attendance records, but whose families had seemingly forgotten they ever existed. What she found hidden beneath the church floorboards would reveal a horror so systematic that local authorities suppressed the evidence for decades. Tonight, we uncover the truth about Cedar Creek's most protected secret. Before we continue with the story of Margaret Wilson and the children who trusted her with their lives, this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the darkest corners of America's religious history. If you're ready to hear stories that few channels dare to tell, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Do you have the courage to discover what really happened in that Methodist church basement? The investigation that followed would expose not just individual evil, but an entire community's willingness to look away when faced with inconvenient truths, and a criminal network that had been operating across the Midwest for over a decade. Cedar Creek sat in the heart of Indiana's coal country, where Methodist faith ran as deep as the mine shafts that honeycombed the earth beneath. By 1876, the town boasted nearly 3,000 souls, most of them God-fearing families drawn by promises of steady work in the expanding rail yards and coal operations that connected Indiana's resources to Chicago's hungry markets. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had reached Cedar Creek in 1871, transforming what had been a sleepy farming community into a bustling hub of commerce and industry. The town's rapid growth brought challenges that tested the social fabric of traditional, rural life. Irish and German immigrants arrived weekly, seeking work in the mines and rail yards, their Catholic and Lutheran faiths creating tensions with the established Protestant majority. Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian congregations competed not just for souls, but for social influence in a community where religious affiliation often determined business opportunities and social standing. The First Methodist Church stood as the community's crown jewel, a magnificent structure of Indiana limestone with twin bell towers that could be heard for miles across the rolling farmland. Completed in 1874, with donations from prosperous merchants and mine owners, the building represented Methodist aspirations to cultural leadership in the rapidly changing town. Its Gothic Revival architecture, stained glass windows imported from Cincinnati, and steam heating system marked it as the most modern religious facility in Hamilton County. Sunday mornings in Cedar Creek meant packed pews and children's voices raised in hymn, but it was the church's Sunday school program that truly set First Methodist apart from neighboring congregations. Under the leadership of teacher Margaret Wilson, a stern-faced woman of 42 who'd arrived from Pennsylvania 5 years prior, the program had grown from a handful of local children to over 200 participants from surrounding counties. Parents brought their children from as far as 20 miles away, enduring difficult wagon rides over muddy roads to participate in what had become legendary throughout central Indiana. Margaret Wilson commanded respect through a combination of biblical knowledge, unwavering discipline, and an apparent gift for transforming even the most unruly children into model citizens. Her background teaching in Philadelphia's industrial schools had given her experience with children from diverse backgrounds, and she seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of how to reach young minds, regardless of their family circumstances or natural abilities. Her assistant, Sarah Coleman, a soft-spoken woman of 38 who'd never married, seemed to possess an almost magical ability to calm even the most restless child with her gentle voice and patient manner. Sarah had joined the program 2 years after Margaret's arrival, coming from a Methodist mission in Cincinnati, where she'd worked with orphaned children. Her references were impeccable, and her dedication to the children's welfare appeared absolute. Together they were supervised by Robert Hayes, a prosperous businessman in his 50s who donated generously to expand the church's educational facilities. Hayes owned interests in 3 coal mines, 2 grain elevators, and the town's largest general store. His appointment to the church board had been unanimous, and his financial contributions had funded not just building improvements, but also the innovative educational programs that were drawing families from across the region. What made Cedar Creek's Sunday school legendary throughout Hamilton County were the special biblical excursions, educational trips that combined scripture study with visits to historical sites across Indiana and neighboring states. These weren't simple afternoon outings, but elaborate week-long journeys that promised to bring Bible stories to life through visits to museums, historical churches, archaeological sites, and even meetings with prominent Methodist educators and missionaries. The program's reputation had grown through word of mouth and occasional articles in Methodist publications that praised Cedar Creek's innovative approach to religious education. Parents throughout the region competed to have their children selected for these prestigious expeditions, which were presented as once-in-a-lifetime opportunities for young minds to expand beyond the limitations of rural life. The Methodist denomination's emphasis on education and social improvement made such programs not just acceptable, but celebrated throughout Protestant America. Since John Wesley's founding principles had emphasized the importance of learning and personal development, Methodist churches were expected to provide educational opportunities that went beyond simple Bible study. In an era when most children received minimal formal schooling, the promise of educational travel represented an extraordinary opportunity for families of modest means. Margaret Wilson's reputation for transforming wayward children into model citizens only added to the program's appeal. She had arrived in Cedar Creek with letters of recommendation from Methodist leaders in Philadelphia, where her work in industrial schools had gained recognition for reducing juvenile delinquency in some of the city's most challenging neighborhoods. Her methods, which emphasized discipline combined with expanded horizons, seemed perfectly suited to the needs of a frontier community struggling with the social changes brought by rapid industrial development. The timing of the program's establishment had been perfect. The panic of 1873 had left many families struggling financially, making the promise of educational opportunities for their children particularly attractive. Parents who could barely afford basic necessities saw Margaret Wilson's program as a way to give their children advantages they could never provide themselves. The fact that these opportunities came through the church gave them additional legitimacy and moral authority. Cedar Creek's Methodist congregation included many of the town's most successful citizens, mine owners, merchants, railroad officials, and prosperous farmers whose support lent credibility to any church-sponsored activity. When such respected community members endorsed the educational program and spoke proudly of their own children's participation, it became almost impossible for other parents to express doubts or concerns without appearing ungrateful or suspicious of beneficial community initiatives. The program's expansion beyond Cedar Creek had been gradual but deliberate. Margaret Wilson had established contacts with Methodist churches in smaller surrounding communities, offering to include their children in the excursions as a service to rural families who lacked access to such educational opportunities. This regional approach not only increased the pool of potential participants, but also made it more difficult for any single community to track patterns or maintain oversight of the program's activities. The first disappearance occurred in September 1876, though no one called it a disappearance at the time. 8-year-old Timothy Morrison had been selected for a special excursion to study ancient biblical practices at a newly discovered archaeological site near Louisville. His parents, recent German immigrants who spoke limited English and worked in Hayes' newest coal mine, received Margaret Wilson's explanation with grateful nods and tears of joy. Timothy had shown exceptional promise in his brief months attending Sunday school, demonstrating an unusual ability to memorize scripture and ask thoughtful questions about biblical stories. Margaret Wilson explained that his intellectual gifts had come to the attention of a Methodist family in Kentucky who specialized in biblical archaeology and ancient studies. They had specifically requested a bright young student to assist with their research while receiving advanced education that would prepare him for possible missionary work or religious scholarship. The opportunity was presented as a rare honor that reflected not just Timothy's abilities, but the quality of Cedar Creek's educational program. The Morrison family would receive regular reports on their son's progress, and Timothy would return after 2 years with knowledge and connections that could transform his life prospects. For parents who had immigrated to America hoping to give their children better opportunities than they had known in Germany, the offer seemed like an answer to their prayers. Timothy's departure barely registered in the community consciousness. The Morrison family seemed proud rather than concerned, and Margaret Wilson's detailed letter explaining the opportunity convinced even skeptical neighbors that the boy had simply been blessed with an extraordinary chance for advancement. The fact that Timothy had always been somewhat quiet and studious made his absence less noticeable among his peer group. 2 weeks later, 10-year-old Mary Catherine Phillips joined an excursion focused on missionary work among distant communities. Her widowed mother, who struggled to support 3 children on the small income from taking in laundry, received assurances that Mary Catherine would be learning valuable skills while helping to establish Sunday schools in newly settled territories. The girl's obvious intelligence and leadership qualities made her selection seem not just reasonable, but inevitable. Mary Catherine had been one of the most popular children in the Sunday school program, known for her ability to help younger children with their lessons and her enthusiastic participation in all activities. Margaret Wilson explained that a Methodist mission organization in Illinois had specifically requested a capable young girl to assist with their work among families moving west. Mary Catherine would receive training in teaching methods while helping to spread Methodist education to frontier communities that lacked established churches. The promise of regular correspondence and eventual return was accompanied by the suggestion that Mary Catherine's experience could lead to a position as a professional teacher or missionary. Careers that would provide financial security and social respectability far beyond what her current circumstances might offer. For a widow facing an uncertain future, the opportunity seemed like divine providence. By Christmas of 1876, 6 more children had departed on various educational expeditions. Each departure followed the same careful pattern, selection-based, on demonstrated merit, detailed explanations of educational opportunities, promises of correspondence that somehow never quite materialized, and reassurances that any lack of communication simply reflected the children's deep immersion in their studies. What made this systematic disappearance possible was a calculated methodology that had nothing to do with educational merit or spiritual development. The genius of Margaret Wilson's system lay in its exploitation of parental aspirations and social expectations. In a community where educational opportunity was scarce and upward mobility rare, the chance for a child to advance through church connections represented a family's greatest hope. To question such opportunities would have seemed not just ungrateful, but potentially damaging to other children's prospects within the program. As Ellen Hartwell would later discover, the selection of children for the excursions followed a calculated methodology that had nothing to do with educational merit or spiritual development. Margaret Wilson and Sarah Coleman had developed a systematic approach to identifying the most vulnerable and valuable candidates for their criminal enterprise. Their primary criteria focused on family circumstances that would make disappearances less likely to trigger immediate investigation. Children from immigrant families were preferred because language barriers and cultural differences made parents less likely to question authority figures or navigate complex inquiries about their children's whereabouts. Recent arrivals to the community were particularly valuable because they lacked established social networks that might notice and investigate unexplained absences. Economic desperation played a crucial role in the selection process. Families struggling financially were more likely to be grateful for opportunities and less likely to ask difficult questions that might jeopardize their children's apparent good fortune. Widowed mothers, large families with limited resources, and parents working in dangerous occupations that could leave children orphaned at any time were all considered ideal candidates. The children themselves were evaluated based on their potential market value in the criminal networks that Margaret Wilson had cultivated over years of careful development. Younger boys with strong builds were destined for industrial work in factories and mines, where their small size and developing strength could be exploited without immediate health consequences. Older girls with pleasant appearances and basic education commanded premium prices in domestic service markets that Ellen would later learn extended far beyond legitimate household employment. Intelligence was actually considered a liability in some cases, as brighter children were more likely to resist indoctrination, attempt escape, or find ways to communicate with their families. Margaret Wilson preferred children who were bright enough to be valuable, but compliant enough to be manageable. The Sunday school program provided an excellent laboratory for observing children's personalities and identifying those most suitable for different types of exploitation. Sarah Coleman's role in this evaluation process proved crucial. Her gentle manner and obvious affection for the children gave her access to intimate details about their fears, hopes, and family relationships. She would spend hours in private conversation with potential candidates, ostensibly providing pastoral care and educational guidance, but actually gathering intelligence that would determine their ultimate fate. The winter of 1876-77 marked a significant expansion in the scope of the operation. Margaret Wilson had established connections with similar programs in Methodist churches throughout Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, creating a regional network that could move children across state lines and make tracking infinitely more difficult. This expansion had been carefully planned to coincide with increased railroad connectivity that made long-distance travel both easier and less conspicuous. Robert Hayes' business connections proved invaluable in facilitating this expansion. His involvement in railroad shipping and grain trading had given him contacts throughout the Midwest, many of whom were willing to assist with discreet transportation arrangements in exchange for favorable business terms. The legitimate cover provided by his various enterprises made it possible to move children across multiple states without arousing suspicion from law enforcement or railroad officials. The financial returns from the operation had exceeded all expectations, generating enough revenue to fund significant expansions of the church's facilities and educational programs. This created a virtuous cycle from the conspirators' perspective. Their criminal profits funded improvements that attracted more families and provided better cover for their activities. The new church basement facilities, funded by Hayes's donations, included private rooms and storage areas that facilitated their operations. By spring 1877, the program was handling children from over 12 different communities, with some families traveling more than 30 miles to participate in Cedar Creek's renowned educational offerings. This geographic spread made it virtually impossible for any single community to notice patterns or maintain oversight of the program's activities. Parents in different towns rarely communicated with each other, and the prestige associated with selection for the excursions discouraged questioning that might seem to challenge the program's integrity. But the true architect of this deception would prove to be someone far more calculating than anyone suspected. The success of the operation attracted attention from criminal networks in major cities, who were eager to establish reliable sources for child labor. Margaret Wilson's reputation for delivering healthy, educated, and properly conditioned children had spread through underground channels, leading to advance orders and premium pricing that transformed what had begun as opportunistic crime into Systematic human trafficking. Sarah Coleman's personal journal, which Ellen Hartwell would eventually discover, revealed the psychological sophistication that made the operation possible. Unlike Margaret Wilson, whose motivations appeared primarily financial, Sarah demonstrated a disturbing fascination with the process of psychological manipulation itself. Her detailed observations of each child's personality, fears, and weaknesses read like clinical studies in human behavior. The journal contained disturbing passages about conditioning children for their eventual destinations. Sarah had developed techniques for gradually separating children from family attachments, identifying which children would adapt best to different types of work, and developing strategies to prevent rebellion or escape attempts. Her apparent affection for the children masked a calculating assessment of their commercial potential and psychological vulnerabilities. One particularly chilling entry described her work with 12-year-old Anna Kowalski, whose selection for a special missionary training program had been celebrated by her Polish immigrant parents as divine blessing. Sarah's notes detailed how she had gradually convinced Anna that her family's poverty and foreign background made them unsuitable guardians for a child with such exceptional spiritual gifts. By the time Anna departed for her supposed missionary training, she had been convinced that serving God required her to abandon her former life entirely. Sarah's methods extended beyond individual manipulation to encompass systematic deception of the broader community. She had crafted a carefully managed correspondence system that created the illusion of ongoing contact with departed children while actually providing no genuine communication at all. Parents received periodic updates written in Sarah's hand, but supposedly dictated by their children, describing progress in their studies and expressing gratitude for the opportunities they were receiving. These fabricated letters served multiple purposes. They reassured parents and prevented persistent inquiries that might lead to investigation. They provided seemingly innocent explanations for the children's continued absence and apparent reluctance to return home. Most importantly, they created a paper trail that could be used to justify the program's activities if questions were ever raised by outside authorities. The sophistication of Sarah's psychological manipulation extended to her relationships with other adults in the community. She had identified key individuals whose support was crucial for maintaining the program's reputation and had developed specific strategies for managing each relationship. Her journal contained detailed profiles of community leaders, noting their personal ambitions, family vulnerabilities, and business interests that could be leveraged to maintain their cooperation. In January 1878, tragedy struck the regular teaching staff when Sarah Coleman fell ill with what the local doctor diagnosed as consumption. The timing was particularly unfortunate, as the program was preparing for its most ambitious series of excursions yet. A coordinated effort that would place nearly 30 children in various locations across the Midwest before the spring planting season made travel more difficult. Sarah's illness created a crisis for the operation. Her intimate knowledge of each child's psychological profile and her carefully cultivated relationships with parents made her irreplaceable in the short term. Margaret Wilson found herself overwhelmed by administrative duties that had previously been shared, while Robert Hayes pressured her to maintain the program's schedule despite the staffing shortage. The church board's decision to hire 24-year-old Ellen Hartwell as a temporary replacement was based primarily on her recent graduation from the Indiana State Normal School and her impressive credentials as a trained educator. What the conspirators failed to anticipate was that Ellen's professional training had taught her the importance of detailed record-keeping and systematic educational assessment, skills that would prove fatal to their carefully constructed deception. Ellen had grown up in a Methodist family in southern Indiana, where her father served as a circuit preacher and her mother taught in various church schools. Her decision to pursue formal education training had been motivated by a desire to improve the quality of religious education available to rural children. She arrived in Cedar Creek with genuine enthusiasm for the program's apparent innovations and high reputation throughout the Methodist community. However, Ellen's professional training would soon lead her to notice discrepancies that others had overlooked. Her first weeks in the position seemed to confirm everything she had heard about the program's quality and effectiveness. The children who remained in regular attendance were indeed well-behaved, knowledgeable about Scripture, and enthusiastic about their studies. The facilities were modern and well-equipped, and the community support for the program was evident in both financial contributions and parental participation. But Ellen's professional training had taught her to look beyond surface appearances and evaluate educational programs based on measurable outcomes and systematic documentation. Her requests to review assessment records, correspondence files, and long-term tracking data were initially deflected by Margaret Wilson with explanations about the unique nature of their program and the confidential relationships they maintained with host families. Ellen's first serious concerns arose when she attempted to prepare lesson plans that would build upon the previous year's curriculum. The absence of detailed records about what children had studied before their departure made it impossible to ensure continuity in the education of their siblings and classmates who remained in the program. When she raised these concerns with Margaret Wilson, she was told that the departed children's studies had been so specialized that their curriculum bore little relationship to the regular Sunday school program. More troubling still, when Ellen casually mentioned some of the missing children in conversations with longtime church members, she was met with confused looks and vague responses. It was as if the community had collectively forgotten these young souls had ever existed. Parents who had once proudly spoken of their children's educational opportunities now seemed reluctant to discuss the subject at all, changing the conversation when Ellen attempted to ask about letters or updates from their absent children. Ellen's professional training had included instruction in recognizing signs of educational fraud and institutional abuse, problems that were becoming increasingly common as demand for educational services outpaced the supply of qualified providers. The pattern she observed in Cedar Creek matched several warning signs she had been taught to identify: vague record-keeping, reluctance to provide documentation, defensive responses to reasonable questions, and systematic isolation of program participants from outside oversight. Her first direct confrontation with Margaret Wilson came in February 1878. Ellen had prepared a letter to send to the families hosting the children on extended excursions, hoping to establish correspondence between the young students and their former classmates. Such communication was standard practice in legitimate educational exchange programs and served important purposes in maintaining emotional connections and assessing student progress. Margaret's reaction was swift and severe. Such contact would disrupt the children's studies and potentially undermine their host's authority. The families hosting the children had specifically requested minimal outside interference to allow the students to fully immerse themselves in their new educational environments. Ellen was forbidden from any communication regarding the absent students and warned that further interference could jeopardize her position and the program's carefully cultivated relationships. The substitute teacher's suspicions deepened when she discovered that none of the churches or educational institutions supposedly hosting the children had ever heard of the Cedar Creek program. Letters sent to Methodist congregations in cities where children had reportedly been placed returned with polite but confused responses. No one had any record of Cedar Creek students or educational exchanges. Ellen's investigation took a crucial turn when she began examining the financial records associated with the educational program. As a trained educator, she understood that legitimate educational exchanges typically involved detailed financial arrangements, insurance considerations, and contractual agreements between participating institutions. The absence of such documentation in Cedar Creek's files seemed increasingly suspicious. Robert Hayes's role in financing the program had always been presented as straightforward philanthropy. a successful businessman supporting community education through generous donations. But Ellen's examination of church financial records revealed a more complex pattern of transactions that seemed inconsistent with simple charitable giving. Large sums of money moved in and out of program accounts with no clear documentation of their purpose or destination. More troubling still were the personal financial changes Ellen observed in the program's leadership. Margaret Wilson had purchased substantial property in Cedar Creek and was reportedly considering investments in California real estate. Sarah Coleman, despite her modest teacher's salary, had accumulated enough savings to afford extended medical treatment in Chicago. Robert Hayes had expanded his business operations significantly, opening new stores in neighboring towns and purchasing additional mining interests. The collective wealth accumulation among the program's leadership seemed far beyond what their legitimate incomes could support. Ellen's father's experience as a circuit preacher had given her familiarity with the typical financial circumstances of Methodist educators and church officials. The prosperity displayed by Cedar Creek's educational leadership was unprecedented in her experience and inconsistent with their supposed dedication to humble service. Ellen's growing unease reached a breaking point when she overheard a conversation between Margaret Wilson and Robert Hayes in the church basement following a Wednesday evening service. Their hushed tones and frequent references to shipments, accounts, and contacts in Chicago seemed entirely inconsistent with educational programming. The fragments of conversation she caught suggested coordination of transportation, discussion of prices, and concerns about maintaining schedules that sounded more like commercial transactions than educational planning. On the night of March 15th, 1878, Ellen Hartwell made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Using her key to the church educational wing, she entered the building long after evening services had concluded. The basement rooms that served as Sunday school classrooms during winter months held secrets she was determined to uncover, regardless of the personal risk or professional consequences. The church basement at night was a maze of shadows and strange sounds. The building's steam heating system created mysterious noises, and the winter wind rattled windows and doors throughout the structure. Ellen's single oil lamp provided barely enough light to navigate the familiar classrooms that seemed transformed and threatening in the darkness. Her hands shook as she began her systematic search of Margaret Wilson's private office. What she found beneath a loose floorboard in Margaret Wilson's private office defied every assumption about the woman's character and motives. A leather-bound ledger contained meticulous records spanning 2 full years, but these weren't educational records. They were business transactions documented with the precision of a commercial enterprise and the cold calculation of systematic exploitation. Each missing child was listed with their age, physical description, family background, and what Ellen gradually realized were sales prices. Timothy Morrison, age 8, sturdy build, docile temperament, German family, limited English, had been sold for $85 to what the ledger cryptically referred to as Chicago textile interests. Mary Catherine Phillips, described as age 10, intelligent, leadership qualities, widowed mother, financially desperate, commanded $120 from Louisville Domestic Services. The entries grew more horrific as Ellen read deeper into the ledger. Children were categorized by their perceived value in different markets. Younger boys went to factories and mines where their small size and developing strength could be exploited. Older girls to domestic service that Ellen feared meant something far worse than legitimate housework. The ledger contained addresses in Chicago, Louisville, Cincinnati, and St. Louis, along with coded references to contacts who could arrange transportation and provide documentation. Most chilling of all were the financial summaries. Over 2 years, Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes had generated over $4,000 in documented revenue from the systematic sale of children, more money than most Cedar Creek families would see in a lifetime. Additional notation suggested this represented only the recorded transactions, with hints of off-books arrangements that could have doubled or tripled their actual profits. The basement yielded additional evidence that painted an even darker picture of the operation's scope and sophistication. Ellen discovered forged letters supposedly written by the missing children, describing happy lives with their new families and expressing gratitude for the opportunities they were receiving. These carefully crafted deceptions had been shown to any parent who became too persistent in their inquiries about their children's welfare. The handwriting was consistent across all the letters, clearly the work of one person creating fictional accounts of children's well-being. The content followed similar patterns, emphasizing how much the children were learning, how grateful they were for their opportunities, and how important it was that they focus on their studies without distractions from their previous lives. Several letters specifically discouraged parents from attempting to visit or maintain regular correspondence. In a locked drawer, Ellen found what appeared to be contracts with various industrial operations and domestic service agencies. The language was carefully coded, but the intent was unmistakable. These were purchase agreements for child labor, arranged through a network of accomplices who had turned human trafficking into a profitable business model. The contracts specified delivery dates, payment terms, and even return policies for children who proved unsuitable for their intended work. The most damning evidence came in the form of correspondence between Margaret Wilson and her contacts in major cities. Letters detailed the specific requirements of various employers, their preferences for children of certain ages, their willingness to pay premium prices for particularly promising students, and their assurances of discretion in handling the arrangements. The correspondence revealed a sophisticated network that extended far beyond Indiana, with connections to similar operations in multiple states. One letter from a Chicago factory owner praised Margaret for the quality of merchandise she provided, noting that Cedar Creek children adapted well to industrial work and caused fewer problems than children acquired through other sources. The letter included specific requests for the next shipment, with detailed specifications for age ranges, physical capabilities, and personality traits that would be most suitable for the factory's operations. Another letter, from what appeared to be a Louisville establishment Ellen dared not fully contemplate, requested specifically girls between ages 12-14 with pleasant demeanor and basic education. The coded language could not disguise the horrific implications of such requests, and Ellen realized that some of the children she had known and taught were likely trapped in situations far worse than industrial exploitation. The systematic nature of the operation became terrifyingly clear as Ellen continued her investigation throughout the night. Margaret Wilson had identified Cedar Creek's Methodist community as an ideal hunting ground, parents trusting enough to surrender their children, isolated enough to prevent easy investigation, and aspirational enough to believe in promises of educational advancement. The church's reputation and the educators' standing in the community provided perfect cover for what amounted to systematic child trafficking. The correspondence revealed that the Cedar Creek operation was part of a much larger network spanning multiple states. Margaret Wilson maintained regular contact with similar operations in Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, sharing information about successful techniques, profitable markets, and law enforcement risks. The network had evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise with specialized roles, established transportation routes, and coordinated timing that maximized profits while minimizing risks. Regional coordination allowed the network to respond quickly to market demands and law enforcement pressures. If investigations threatened one location, children could be rapidly moved to other parts of the network until the danger passed. The correspondence showed that Cedar Creek had served as a temporary refuge for children from operations that had been compromised in other states, while also sending its own victims to safer locations when local pressures increased. But perhaps most horrifying was the discovery of Sarah Coleman's personal journal, hidden behind a false wall in the basement. Storage room. The gentle woman who had seemed so genuinely caring revealed herself as the operation's psychological architect, whose detailed observations of each child's personality, fears, and weaknesses had been used to determine their market value and appropriate placement. Sarah's journal contained disturbing passages about methodically breaking down children's resistance and family attachments. She had developed specific techniques for different types of children. How to convince intelligent children that compliance was their only option, how to use religious instruction to create guilt and submission, and how to identify and exploit each child's deepest fears to ensure cooperation during the transition to their new circumstances. The journal revealed that Sarah's apparent illness was likely fabricated to provide cover for the operation's final phase. Her medical treatment in Chicago was actually coordination with network partners to complete the largest transaction in the operation's history, a bulk sale of over 30 children to various industrial and domestic operations throughout the Midwest. Hidden among Sarah's papers, Ellen discovered something that chilled her more than all the financial records and correspondence combined: fragmentary testimonies from children who had attempted to escape or communicate with their families. These desperate messages had been intercepted and preserved, apparently as insurance against network partners who might consider betraying the operation. One note, written in a child's careful handwriting, read, "Mama, they told me you didn't want me anymore because I was bad. I work in the big building with the loud machines. My hands hurt all the time and I'm so tired. Please come get me. I promise I'll be good." The note was marked with an address in Chicago and a notation indicating it had been intercepted before delivery. Another fragment, apparently torn from a larger letter, contained a girl's plea. "The lady here says I have to be grateful for my food and bed, but she makes me do things that feel wrong. I remember what you taught me about right and wrong, but she says God wants me to obey. I'm scared and I want to come home." The handwriting was identified in Sarah's careful notation as belonging to Mary Catherine Phillips. These testimonies revealed the psychological warfare that accompanied the physical exploitation. Children were systematically convinced that their families had abandoned them, that their suffering was deserved punishment for unspecified sins, and that submission to their circumstances was both inevitable and morally required. The religious framework that had initially attracted their families was perverted into a tool for maintaining control and preventing resistance. As Ellen continued reading through the horrific documentation, she realized the conspirators were preparing to vanish entirely. Ellen realized that the children who had been sold were not just physically enslaved, but psychologically broken in ways that would make rescue and recovery extraordinarily difficult. Even if law enforcement could locate and free them, the damage to their minds and spirits might never fully heal. The true scope of the crime extended far beyond the initial trafficking to encompass systematic psychological torture designed to destroy any hope of escape or recovery. The financial records revealed that the three conspirators had been preparing to abandon Cedar Creek entirely by the summer of 1878, taking their accumulated profits to California, where they planned to establish themselves under new identities. The timing was carefully calculated to coincide with the completion of their largest transaction and the implementation of new railroad schedules that would facilitate rapid travel westward. Margaret Wilson had already purchased property near San Francisco under an assumed name, while Robert Hayes had been liquidating his Indiana business interests and converting assets to portable forms that could be easily transported. Sarah Coleman's supposed illness provided cover for her gradual withdrawal from community obligations and preparation for departure. The final excursion would have netted them enough money to fund their escape and early retirement in comfortable circumstances. The plan's sophistication extended to detailed contingency preparations for various scenarios. If their activities were discovered before their departure, they had prepared false documentation, established escape routes, and identified criminal contacts who could provide assistance in avoiding law enforcement. The correspondence showed they had even considered eliminating potential witnesses who might threaten their escape. Ellen's discovery of these escape plans revealed the urgency of her situation. The conspirators were not planning a gradual withdrawal, but a rapid abandonment that would leave their victims with no hope of rescue and no possibility of justice. The 23 children scheduled for the upcoming excursion were not just facing exploitation, but potential disappearance into a criminal network that spanned the continent. The realization that she was probably the only person who knew the truth and had access to evidence created a terrible burden of responsibility. Any delay in acting could result in the permanent loss of nearly 24 more children, while premature action might allow the conspirators to escape justice and continue their operations elsewhere. Ellen faced an impossible choice between children's immediate safety and the broader goal of exposing the entire network. Ellen's discovery of the evidence coincided with Margaret Wilson's announcement of the most ambitious excursion yet, a month-long trip to historical biblical sites that would take 23 children as far as Philadelphia and possibly Boston. The timing was no coincidence. Ellen realized this represented the operation's final harvest before the conspirators disappeared with their accumulated profits. The substitute teacher faced an impossible choice. Local law enforcement included several men who owed their positions to Robert Hayes' political influence, and the Methodist Church hierarchy had invested considerable prestige in Cedar Creek's acclaimed educational program. Any accusation against such respected community figures would be met with skepticism at best, and more likely with charges of slander that could destroy her career and credibility. The children selected for the upcoming excursion represented a cross-section of the community's most vulnerable families. Ellen recognized names she had come to know during her months in Cedar Creek. Bright, trusting students who had grown to love their classes and looked forward to what they believed would be the adventure of their lifetimes. She could not allow 23 more children to disappear into the nightmare she had uncovered. The decision to act came when Ellen realized that Sarah Coleman's supposed departure for medical treatment in Chicago was actually the beginning of the operation's final phase. The timing of her illness corresponded exactly with the preparation for the largest transaction in the network's history. If Ellen waited for more evidence or attempted to work through official channels, it would be too late to prevent the systematic destruction of an entire generation of Cedar Creek's children. On March 28, 1878, Ellen Hartwell broke into the church basement one final time. Not to gather evidence, but to steal it. She took the ledger, the correspondence, Sarah Coleman's journal, and every document that could prove the conspiracy's existence and scope. She knew that their disappearance would alert the conspirators to her discovery, but she hoped that documented proof would force authorities to act before the final excursion could depart. Her timing proved both fortunate and tragic. Margaret Wilson's immediate response to the missing evidence was to accelerate the final excursion, moving the departure date up by a full week and changing the announced destination to confuse any potential investigation. But Ellen's desperate nighttime ride to the county seat in Noblesville, where she presented her evidence to Circuit Judge William Marshall, set in motion events that would finally bring justice to Cedar Creek. Judge Marshall's examination of Ellen's evidence left no room for doubt about the conspiracy's scope and horror. More importantly, his immediate telegrams to law enforcement in Chicago, Louisville, and other cities resulted in coordinated raids that rescued 11 children before they could be permanently lost in the urban underworld. The rescue operations revealed that the network extended even further than Ellen's evidence had suggested. with connections to criminal organizations throughout the Midwest and beyond. The arrest of Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes on March 30, 1878, sent shockwaves through Cedar Creek's Methodist community. The three conspirators were taken into custody as they attempted to board a westbound train with substantial amounts of cash and forged travel documents. Their capture revealed the final pieces of a puzzle that had taken Ellen months to assemble, but the deeper horror came with the realization that an entire town had somehow failed to notice the systematic disappearance of 50 children over 2 years. The subsequent investigation revealed the psychological manipulation that had made such massive deception possible. Parents had been carefully selected for their circumstances: recent immigrants, widows, families struggling financially, people who would be grateful for opportunities and reluctant to ask difficult questions. The gradual nature of the disappearances had prevented any single dramatic event that might have triggered community alarm. Detective Samuel Morrison of the Indiana State Police, who led the investigation following the arrests, discovered that the conspirators had exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology and social organization. People naturally avoided discussing painful subjects like missing children, especially when presented with reasonable explanations for their absence. The community had collectively participated in a form of willful blindness that allowed the crime to continue undetected. More disturbing still was the revelation that several community members had harbored private suspicions but had chosen to remain silent rather than challenge respected authority figures. The investigation uncovered at least 6 families who had noticed patterns or inconsistencies but had convinced themselves that their concerns were unfounded or inappropriate. The social pressure to maintain harmony and trust in church leadership had created an environment where even reasonable suspicions were suppressed. The Methodist Church hierarchy's response revealed institutional priorities that prioritized reputation over accountability. Rather than conducting a thorough investigation of how such crimes could have occurred under church auspices, denominational leaders focused on containing the scandal and minimizing damage to the church's public image. This institutional response created additional barriers to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy and prevented implementation of safeguards that might have protected other communities. Sarah Coleman's journal proved particularly valuable in understanding how the operation had maintained its cover for so long. Her careful study of each family's dynamics had allowed the conspirators to craft perfectly targeted explanations for each child's departure. Parents with religious aspirations were told their children were pursuing advanced biblical studies. Families struggling economically were assured their children were gaining valuable job skills. Ambitious parents were convinced their children were making social connections that would benefit the entire family. The coordinated arrests across multiple states revealed that the Cedar Creek operation was just one node in a criminal network that had been operating across the Midwest for over a decade. Law enforcement agencies in Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Missouri discovered similar operations using identical methods and often involving the same network of criminal contacts in major cities. The investigation revealed that Margaret Wilson's background in Philadelphia had provided the initial connections for establishing the trafficking network. Her supposed experience in industrial schools had actually been involvement with criminal organizations that supplied child labor to factories and other enterprises willing to exploit vulnerable workers. Her move to Cedar Creek had been a deliberate expansion of these operations into rural communities where oversight was minimal and trust was high. Robert Hayes's business connections had provided crucial infrastructure for the network's operations. His involvement in railroad shipping and grain trading had given him legitimate reasons to travel frequently and maintain contacts throughout the region. His warehouses and transportation arrangements had been used to move children across state lines without arousing suspicion from law enforcement or transportation officials. The financial investigation revealed that the 3 conspirators had accumulated far more wealth than their documented transactions suggested. Hidden accounts, Property purchases under false names and complex financial arrangements indicated that the Cedar Creek operation had generated over $50,000 in profits, an enormous sum that placed the conspirators among the wealthiest individuals in Indiana. This financial success had funded the expansion of their operations and provided resources for corrupting officials and maintaining their cover. The network's reach extended beyond simple trafficking to encompass systematic corruption of law enforcement, political officials, and business leaders in multiple communities. The investigation discovered that substantial bribes had been paid to sheriffs, judges, and railroad officials to ensure cooperation and prevent investigation. This corruption had created a protective umbrella that allowed the network to operate with impunity for years. Of the 50 children who had disappeared from Cedar Creek, the coordinated rescue operations managed to locate and recover only 18. Most had been so thoroughly integrated into industrial operations or domestic service that identifying them proved nearly impossible. The psychological trauma they had endured left many unable to readjust to normal family life, creating a secondary tragedy that haunted Cedar Creek for generations. The rescued children's testimonies revealed the systematic psychological warfare that had accompanied their physical exploitation. They had been told that their families had sold them because they were unwanted burdens, that their suffering was punishment for unspecified sins, and that any attempt to escape or communicate with their former lives would result in severe consequences for both themselves and their families. Medical examinations of the recovered children revealed evidence of malnutrition, physical abuse, and exposure to dangerous working conditions that had caused permanent health problems. Several children showed signs of industrial accidents, missing fingers, respiratory problems from textile dust, and developmental delays from prolonged exposure to dangerous chemicals. The full scope of their physical suffering was matched by psychological damage that would require years of careful treatment to address. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the children who initially resisted rescue efforts, having been so thoroughly conditioned to believe that their circumstances were normal and deserved. Several children had to be gradually convinced that their rescuers were legitimate and that they would not be punished for accepting help. The depth of psychological manipulation they had experienced demonstrated the criminal sophistication of the network's operations. The investigation also revealed that at least 12 children had died while in the custody of their purchasers, victims of industrial accidents, disease, or abuse that would never be properly investigated or prosecuted. These deaths had been covered up through falsified records and corrupt officials who ensured that no inconvenient questions were asked about the fate of children who had supposedly never existed in official documentation. The trials of Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes became a sensation throughout Indiana and beyond. The prosecution's presentation of evidence laid bare not just the scope of their crimes, but the vulnerability that had made Cedar Creek such perfect hunting grounds for criminal exploitation. The testimony of rescued children, presented with careful attention to their psychological fragility, provided devastating evidence of the conspiracy's impact. Margaret Wilson's defense attempted to portray her as a misguided idealist who had believed she was providing opportunities for disadvantaged children. This strategy collapsed when prosecutors presented evidence of her detailed financial records and correspondence with criminal contacts that demonstrated clear awareness of the illegal nature of her activities. Her final testimony revealed a calculating individual who had exploited religious faith and parental love for purely financial gain. Sarah Coleman's psychological manipulation proved more difficult to prosecute under existing legal frameworks. While her role in conditioning children and deceiving families was clearly documented, the subtle nature of psychological abuse was not well understood by legal authorities in 1878. Her defense argued that her care for the children had been genuine, even if misguided, but the evidence of systematic emotional manipulation ultimately convinced the jury of her criminal intent. Robert Hayes's trial focused on his role in financing and facilitating the operation. His attorneys argued that his business activities had been legitimate and that any involvement with the trafficking network had been unknowing. However, the financial evidence and correspondence demonstrated his central role in planning and executing the conspiracy. His conviction on multiple counts of conspiracy and trafficking resulted in the longest prison sentence of the three conspirators. The legal proceedings also revealed significant gaps in existing laws regarding child trafficking and exploitation. The prosecution had to rely on various fraud, kidnapping, and conspiracy statutes that were not specifically designed to address systematic trafficking operations. The complexity of interstate criminal activity exposed weaknesses in law enforcement coordination that would not be adequately addressed for decades. The Methodist Church's response to the scandal revealed institutional priorities that placed reputation management above accountability and victim support. Rather than conducting a comprehensive investigation of how such crimes could have occurred under church auspices, denominational leaders focused on damage control and distancing themselves from the Cedar Creek operation. Church officials argued that the crimes had been perpetrated by individuals who had deceived the church as thoroughly as they had deceived the community. While technically accurate, this response ignored the institutional failures that had enabled the conspiracy to operate undetected. The lack of oversight, the absence of verification procedures for educational programs, and the culture of unquestioning trust in authority figures had all contributed to creating an environment where such crimes could flourish. The church's refusal to implement systematic reforms or provide support for victims' families created additional trauma for the affected community. Parents who had lost children felt abandoned by the institution they had trusted with their most precious possessions. The lack of institutional accountability reinforced the sense that their children's suffering had been meaningless and that nothing had been learned from the tragedy. Local law enforcement's failures were equally significant. Sheriff Thomas Bradley's investigation revealed that multiple reports and concerns had been dismissed without proper investigation over the 2-year period of the conspiracy's operation. The combination of political corruption, professional incompetence, and social pressure to avoid challenging respected community figures had created a perfect environment for criminal exploitation. The railroad companies whose infrastructure had been used to transport children across state lines also escaped accountability for their role in enabling the conspiracy. While their employees' cooperation had been purchased through bribes rather than corporate policy, the lack of oversight and verification procedures for passenger transportation had facilitated the trafficking operation. No significant changes in transportation security or verification procedures resulted from the investigation. Ellen Hartwell's role in exposing the conspiracy made her a hero to some and a pariah to others within the Cedar Creek community. Many residents blamed her for destroying the town's reputation and bringing unwanted attention to their community. The social pressure and hostility she faced in the aftermath of the trials made it impossible for her to continue living in Cedar Creek. The psychological burden of her discovery and its aftermath haunted Ellen for the rest of her life. She had saved 23 children from immediate trafficking, but could not save the 32 who had already disappeared into the criminal network. The knowledge that her earlier action might have prevented additional disappearances created a sense of guilt that no amount of rational analysis could eliminate. Ellen's professional career suffered significant damage from her involvement in the case. Many educational institutions viewed her as a troublemaker who had violated professional norms by investigating her colleagues and superiors. Her attempts to implement safeguards and verification procedures in subsequent positions were often met with resistance from administrators who preferred traditional approaches based on trust and personal relationships. The personal cost of her heroism extended beyond professional consequences to encompass social isolation and psychological trauma. Ellen never married, partly because potential suitors were deterred by her association with the scandal, and partly because her experience had made her profoundly suspicious of people's motivations and claims. She spent the remainder of her career moving between different teaching positions, never staying long enough to form the deep community connections that might have exposed her to similar betrayals. Despite these personal costs, Ellen continued to advocate for educational reforms and child protection measures throughout her career. Her writings and speeches emphasized the importance of institutional oversight, verification procedures, and systematic monitoring of educational programs. While her specific recommendations were rarely implemented during her lifetime, her advocacy contributed to gradual improvements in educational standards and child protection policies. The Cedar Creek scandal had lasting impacts that extended far beyond the immediate community. News coverage of the trials and investigation created national awareness of child trafficking issues and the vulnerability of rural communities to criminal exploitation. However, the lack of systematic follow-up and institutional reform limited the long-term benefits of this increased awareness. The Methodist denomination's handling of the scandal influenced denominational policies regarding educational programs and oversight procedures. While no comprehensive reforms were implemented immediately, the embarrassment and legal liability associated with the Cedar Creek case contributed to gradually increased scrutiny of church-sponsored activities involving children. These changes, while incremental, may have prevented similar large-scale operations in other Methodist communities. The financial impact on Cedar Creek was severe and long-lasting. The town's reputation as a safe and respectable community was permanently damaged, leading to reduced business investment and population decline. Many families who had lost children left the area entirely, unable to remain in a place associated with such profound trauma. The economic consequences of the scandal contributed to Cedar Creek's gradual decline from a prosperous industrial center to a struggling rural community. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states used the Cedar Creek case as a catalyst for improved coordination and information sharing. The investigation had revealed the inadequacy of state and local authorities in addressing interstate criminal activity. While significant improvements in law enforcement coordination would not occur until the early 20th century, the Cedar Creek case provided important precedents for federal involvement in interstate crimes. The rescued children's long-term outcomes varied significantly based on their individual circumstances and the support they received from their families and communities. Some managed to rebuild their lives and achieve relative normalcy, while others struggled with lasting psychological and physical damage from their experiences. The lack of systematic support services for trafficking victims meant that recovery was largely dependent on family resources and individual resilience. 20 years after the arrests, a follow-up investigation attempted to determine the ultimate fate of all 50 missing children. The results were sobering. 18 had been rescued and returned to their families, 12 had been confirmed dead through various means, and 20 remained missing with no reliable information about their whereabouts or condition. The investigation concluded that most of the missing children had likely died in industrial accidents, from disease, or as a result of abuse, but the lack of documentation made definitive conclusions impossible. The financial investigation revealed that the conspirators' total profits from the operation had exceeded $75,000, an enormous sum that placed them among the wealthiest criminals in American history. Most of this money was never recovered, having been hidden in accounts and investments that could not be traced through the limited investigative techniques available in the 1870s. The victims' families received minimal compensation, and many remained in poverty for the rest of their lives. Margaret Wilson died in prison in 1884, having served only 6 years of her 20-year sentence. Sarah Coleman was released in 1885 due to poor health and disappeared entirely, with no reliable records of her subsequent whereabouts or activities. Robert Hayes served 12 years and was released in 1890, eventually moving to California, where he lived under an assumed name until his death in 1903. The network's other participants faced varying fates depending on their level of involvement and the effectiveness of local prosecution efforts. Some escaped justice entirely by fleeing to territories where law enforcement was minimal, while others received light sentences that reflected the limited understanding of trafficking crimes. At the time, the lack of coordination between different jurisdictions meant that the full scope of the network was never completely mapped or dismantled. More than a century has passed since these events unfolded, yet the lessons of Cedar Creek remain painfully relevant to our modern world. The Cedar Creek case demonstrates how easily trusted institutions can become vehicles for systematic evil when adequate oversight and accountability measures are absent. The conspirators' success depended not on elaborate deception, but on exploiting natural human tendencies to trust authority figures and avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. Their crimes were facilitated by a community's willingness to accept convenient explanations rather than ask difficult questions. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the trafficking operations succeeded not because of extraordinary criminal genius, but because of ordinary human failings, greed, willful blindness, and the desire to believe that authority figures are inherently trustworthy. The systematic nature of the crimes required careful planning and execution, but the underlying conditions that made them possible exist in many communities where people prefer comfort to vigilance. The psychological manipulation employed by Sarah Coleman reveals the vulnerability of children to authority figures who exploit their natural trust and desire for approval. Her techniques were not particularly sophisticated by modern standards, but they were devastatingly effective against children who had been taught to respect and obey adult authority without question. The religious framework that should have protected these children was perverted into a tool for ensuring their compliance and silence. Ellen Hartwell's courage in exposing the conspiracy illustrates both the power of individual moral action and the personal costs that such action often entails. Her willingness to risk her career and personal safety to protect children she barely knew demonstrates the kind of moral courage that society desperately needs, but rarely rewards adequately. The hostility she faced from her own community reveals how difficult it can be to challenge established systems even when they harbor terrible secrets. If you've stayed with this story until now, you're clearly someone who isn't afraid to confront the darkest chapters of our history. The courage shown by Ellen Hartwell reminds us that sometimes one person's willingness to act can save countless lives. What would you have done in her situation? Would you have had the bravery to investigate when everyone else was looking away? Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature, and hit that like button if this story gave you chills. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales that uncover the secrets hidden in America's religious history. The Cedar Creek tragedy raises questions that remain relevant today. How can communities protect vulnerable populations without becoming paralyzed by suspicion? What institutional safeguards can prevent the exploitation of trust while preserving the social cooperation that makes community life possible? How should society balance the presumption of innocence for authority figures against the need to protect those under their care? Modern child protection systems incorporate many lessons learned from cases like Cedar Creek, but new forms of exploitation continue to emerge as technology and social organization evolve. The fundamental human vulnerabilities that the conspirators exploited, parental aspirations, economic desperation, and deference to authority, remain unchanged, creating ongoing challenges for those responsible for protecting children and other vulnerable populations. The institutional failures revealed in the Cedar Creek case, inadequate oversight, resistance to accountability measures, and prioritization of reputation over victim welfare, continue to manifest in contemporary scandals involving religious organizations, educational institutions, and other trusted entities. The specific methods may change, but the underlying patterns of institutional self-protection and victim abandonment remain disturbingly consistent across different eras and contexts. Perhaps the most important lesson from Cedar Creek is that preventing such tragedies requires active vigilance rather than passive trust. Ellen Hartwell's investigation succeeded not because she possessed extraordinary abilities, but because she insisted on documentation, verification, and accountability when others were content to accept reassuring explanations. Her example demonstrates that protecting vulnerable populations requires ordinary people to ask uncomfortable questions and demand satisfactory answers. This mystery shows us how the most trusted institutions can harbor the darkest secrets, and how easily we can become complicit in evil through our willingness to believe comfortable lies. What do you think of this story? Do you believe an entire community could truly forget 50 missing children? Or were there others who knew and chose to remain silent? Were Margaret Wilson and her accomplices monsters, or ordinary people corrupted by opportunity and greed? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how such tragedies can be prevented in our own time. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden horror and want more stories that uncover America's darkest religious secrets, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates mysteries that challenge what we think we know about the past. The truth about Cedar Creek reminds us that vigilance is the price of protecting the innocent, and that sometimes the greatest evil comes disguised as the greatest good. See you in the next video.